Welcome, everyone, to another segment of Your Schools in Action. And your host, Greg Oakes, has an opportunity today to inform the public with some expertise from the schools that's going to give us an education on how schools are funded, how the money flow is, and give everyone an insight and an opportunity to get a greater understanding of how the operation side of the school actually works. I have on my right Dr. Matson, your superintendent, and I have Larry Martini, the business manager of Forest Lake. Welcome to the show, and we thank you for taking the time to help us educate the public on the operations of our school. To begin with, Larry, why don't you just give an overview of your job, what you end up doing, how it functions, and then we'll start getting into some questions.
Well, as business manager, folks are very familiar with the idea that I must be responsible for the budget and the money and things of that nature. But I also have oversight in food service, transportation, so there's a lot of logistics getting kids back and forth to school. And we manage quite an office staff for the accounts receivable and the payroll. We're a people organization, so the payroll function is big in this organization.
Dr. Matson, on one of probably the toughest jobs as a superintendent is always to have to make the final decision on expenses and all this type of thing. How much time is involved with coming up with an operational budget, a functioning budget, and an agreement on a budget?
You know, we spend a lot of time, and it certainly isn't a chunk of time during a particular time of the year. There's certainly more emphasis at certain times, but you have to remember that a lot of times we're looking to the past of what's happened in the previous year and finalizing those numbers. We're living in the current school year, and then we're also thinking ahead to the next year. So there's a lot of time that is spent, but we have what we would call cabinet meetings every Monday. And Larry is part of that, along with the other 4 directors, Ross Bennett in communications, Lloyd Komatsu in assessment is there as well. And so we talk about the budget in some form, typically every week. Many times it's a quick check-in. Sometimes it's much more involved, looking at projections for the next year. What are we looking at for staffing? That's the point that we're at right now. Talking about staffing for next year. So kindergarten roundup is happening all during February.
Teeth already.
We have, and that's changed over the years. Parents want to make decisions earlier than they did a few years ago. And registration at the high school is happening and at the junior highs. So we look at all of those pieces and make decisions about staffing for next year, which of course, as Larry mentioned, we're a people organization, so that impacts the budget as well. So it's a continual conversation about the budget, and there are certain times of the year when we're more focused on it, but it's continual.
You know, Greg, we have several different funds, but in the general fund, 80% of the expenditures are for people.
That's usually pretty lopsided in the secular world, because usually it's about 50% of the operational costs. There's salaries, benefits, and that. Larry, when the final number comes back to you and you get to start breaking everything down and start to realize that it's going to cost X many dollars next year to run the school district. How and where and when and all these type of things, do you find out when the money is going to be made available? Do you need to make a request to somebody for the money? Then the second thing is then where's the bank? How does the money flow? And the reason I'm bringing that up is the average person looks at their tax statement, that they get in the mail, and so much is for the county, so much goes to, assessment, so much goes to this and that, and then they have the breakdown on the schools. In the breakdown on the schools, how does that explanation, is it real simple for the average taxpayer to look at it, or most people like myself, all you do is look at the bottom right hand corner, it says it's going down 2% or it's going up 5%, and you don't really pay any attention. How is that those numbers that are on the tax statement, how do you generate that information for the county to publish?
Excellent question. Now, we don't actually make a request on an annual basis. The state legislature determines the funding for school districts. In Forest Lake, the property taxes that you're speaking of represent about 15% of our funding. State aids represent about 80% of the funding. And the legislature determines how much we get in each category of state aid or the various categories of property taxes. So when people get a property tax statement, they'll see the county listed first. The school district has a couple of lines. One of them is determined at the state level. The other is a voter-approved line for operating levies if we make a request for additional funding for educational purposes, or for debt service whenever we remodel facilities or sell bonds. Those two components are in the voter-approved line. Then the next line down on a property tax statement is city, and then you get to some other taxing jurisdictions, and it's a total. The county does all the work spreading those dollars. We really work with the large 15% number. And in the general fund, that's anywhere from $9 million to $10 million on an annual basis. They determine that at the conclusion of each legislative session, and then we work in the summer to verify those numbers. We go through a property tax hearing process, but we're on a fiscal year basis. Cities and counties are on a calendar year basis. Mm-hmm. So when we have property tax season along with cities and counties, we're actually discussing the budget we're currently in, not the one we're developing. The legislature, in the state aid process, now remember that's more than 80% of the general fund, that's often determined after we've pretty much finalized our budget. Our budget must be determined by June 30th in order to expend funds on July 1st. So we have a finance committee, the school board meets, Dr. Mattson mentioned the staffing process we go through in the spring. Most of that is set, and the legislature determines whether they're going to give us an increase or not in state aids. Oftentimes, they involve a special session that's in July or August.
Yeah, I was just going to say, how do
Hence
you
the
do that
dilemma
then?
that all 300 school districts across the state face. We're pretty good at estimating what they'll do because we're watching their process as it unfolds.
You brought up a million good questions that I wanted to expand on. One of them is, what happens if you've already got everything in place and you've committed to everything, and then they don't allocate the funds? What do you do then? Like hiring,
There are
staffing.
two methods in which the state might actually not allocate the funds. One of them is a cash flow concept. There's a state metering system designed to pay these state aids every 2 weeks to us. And they may slow that system down to help balance the state budget. And if we end up in a cash flow crunch, we have to go out and get certificates of anticipation because they eventually will pay us. They're just delaying the payment. That's very parallel to a working capital loan in the private sector.
Yeah.
On the other hand, if we anticipated the increase 2%, 3% for this school year and it only came out at 1%, we would need to look in our budget and see if there's expenditures in purchasing, possibly services that we contract for. We can adjust some of our staffing, but the bulk of our staffing we cannot because in Minnesota we have the Public Labor Relations Act. Teachers sign a contract for the whole year. So once we're underway, we can't cut faculty. We might be able to adjust some of our classified positions. And as I mentioned before, with 80% of our budget and more than half of that being faculty, it's tough to make an adjustment if we anticipate incorrectly.
Boy, I would certainly think so. It's, I was unaware that and I'm assuming that this act was also in conjunction with the union agreement also. Is that a correct assumption?
Yes, almost 85% of our employees within the general fund have a union representing them. The Public Labor Relations Act allows for unions, and so we're constantly bargaining. In Minnesota, it's 2-year terms. There are some unions that can have a 3-year term, but generally 2-year terms. And we're not always current. That doesn't mean that the people are working without a contract. They're working off the conditions on the old contract that expired, but they still have employment rights. So there are times when we might slow down the bargaining process to find out what the legislature has provided, and in the event that they tell us finally in August, we might settle a contract in September or October.
And then it would be retroactive?
Ours typically are, but that's not always the case.
Oh, I know with the city, when we always got into our contract negotiations, they were, the manager at that time tried to get it for a 3-year commitment. Then he had a couple of them that he got put through for a 5-year commitment, you know, for stabilization. And that always, then a lot of times they came back halfway through and wanted to renegotiate the contract, and, you know, but, so we had a real similar kind of situation at that point. Dr. Matson, if, when you have, are the hiring of principals on the same basis of hiring teachers? Or is there a separate way that you have to deal with either or?
With the hiring?
Yes.
Typically, the building principal is the one that's in charge of hiring for their particular building. So if there is a math opening at the high school, Steve Massey would be in charge of posting that position, reviewing the people that have sent in resumes and applications, would set up the interviews, and then would put together that interview team, and then would be in charge of conducting those interviews and then offering the person the position. With principals, we do have a school district policy that talks about having 2 committees. One is an administrative committee, and then the other committee is other staff members, so it might be teachers, administrative assistants, custodians, et cetera, as well as parents and community members that are on that committee. So every candidate that comes in, people will apply. I'm ultimately in charge of deciding who would interview, and then that person would interview with both of those committees. We talk about those candidates separately in those committees, come up with our top 2 to 4 candidates, then come together as a large group, do the same thing. Then and I'm part of that process, but then those recommendations are given to me. Then we check references, and then I make a recommendation to the school board. Any principal, of course, does offer the position, but the school board has the ultimate authority, of course, in hiring all the employees in the school district.
Does the school board participate in these committees that you had mentioned?
No, they do not.
Okay, so everything had been pretty well screened, and the person has been brought forward, and then they say yay or nay, and have they ever said nay?
I'm sure that there have been potentially a few cases. It's very rare.
I was
It's
just gonna
very
say,
rare.
I can't imagine it, but.
It's very rare in our district or in any school district, because there is that set process that is very thorough. But it does come before them. So at every school board meeting, you will see a list of folks that are retiring, resigning, maybe being transferred within the organization and being hired. And the school board does approve all of those moves, those personnel moves within the school district.
When you have somebody that leaves halfway through the year for whatever reason, whether it's their choice, another choice, whatever choices, do you have to pay the contract that they have signed for that calendar year as income to them?
No, it depends on the situation. So sometimes someone might be in a situation where a family member is, moving to another part of the country because of a job opportunity, and they've signed a contract with us, and they want to move with their family, and so they will submit that letter. And typically, what's said is that if we can find a suitable replacement, we will release them from their contract. And usually we're able to do that in those situations. So then that contract would end, and then we'd hire someone else.
Got it.
You know, Greg,
Okay.
you had mentioned whether or not the board is involved with 7 elementary schools, 2 junior highs, and the high school, and the fact that we have more than 500 faculty. It's amazing to think that the school board would be involved with those.
Well,
hires.
I was.
It's a really big organization.
Well, that was my next question. I was coming back to you and say, okay, now that we know how the process goes through, how many teachers and everybody is the payroll? Because you're a very nice sized company in the United States today. And if you want to look at it, I can look at it that you are a company for all practical purposes. Only difference is you don't generate profits, because the profits come out of what you put out at the end, and ends up being the results of success for our students.
We're developing quite a bit of intellectual property.
There you go. There you go.
You know, we're a $65 million general fund organization, and so 80% of that is in excess of $50 million for, the payroll.
Yeah.
We have community ed as a separate fund. We have food service as a separate fund. Now, food service runs that typical 50-50 labor and product expense. We've got debt service fund and some other small related funds. In total, $80 million organization. So we are quite large.
Yes,
But then
you are.
we cover 3 counties. We've got a portion of Chisago County, a portion of Anoka County, because we're from Linwood Township, Columbus and East Bethel, down to Lino Lakes, and then all the way out to Scandia in Washington County here. So quite a large geographic area as well.
One of the questions I have been asked, because I try to poke around with people and ask them, say, hey, what kind of question would you like to have asked? And one of the questions is how do you get your money? How does it end up in the big district bank account? How does it get there? And then how does it get dispersed? What mechanisms are there in place for the dispersion of the capital that you get?
Sure. About 3% of our money is actually local fees and revenues. If there's kids participating in sports programs or other fees that the parents write the check to the school district. About 4% of our money comes from the federal government, things like Title I programming or special education. Now, the original source of the federal dollars is federal income tax that individuals and corporations pay. Earlier in our discussion, I mentioned state aids. So those are state dollars determined by the legislature, but that's originally sourced at sales tax paid to the state of Minnesota and state income tax by individuals and corporations. And then rounding out our mix, about 15% of our money in the general fund particularly is property taxes. So those are the 4 sources of funding that we get. They're metered in different manners, but they are automatically deposited into our account depending on timing. The state aids, as I mentioned, is every couple of weeks. Property taxes is much like the payment cycle that people experience themselves. If you have a May or an October residential payment that's due, we receive those dollars through the county about a month later. And the federal metering system is about a year after the program has concluded and tied out and been audited.
How is the internal functioning of, I'm going to call it the accounting department. That may not be the right terminology, but let's call it accounting department. How does the accounting department set up and as far as dispersing and, is payroll once a week, twice a week, twice a month? How does payroll work? Things of that nature for the teachers.
For the longest time, we had 2.5 FTE in payroll, but with some of the federal constraints we're facing, we've had to add some staffing, and now we're at 3.5 FTE for payroll. They cut checks for over 1,100 persons, so food service, community education, and the general fund, over 1,100 checks every 2 weeks or 26 times a year. In terms of the other components, We've got an accounts payable department because the remaining 20% of that 65 million, that's a heck of a big number. So we're buying goods and services, textbooks, desks, chairs. We have outside vendors that repair things for us. We outsource some things that we don't do ourselves. Busing, of course, we do ourselves. But paying for the fuel, all of those things go through two people that work here in the district office. And I've got a controller and an assistant who assists in all of that process. We're annually audited. Our books close on June 30th. We've got auditors in for a couple of weeks in September. Once we've got all of our accruals posted and things finalized and settled, and that audit report is delivered to the school board in December. Pretty typical for a government. A city will often have its audit findings delivered in May or June,
Yeah, we had it in May.
and the county, May or June, because that's 5 months later. So
Yeah.
we have a lot of parallels with city government or county government, but again, we're 6 months off cycle because we're a fiscal year of July 1 to June 30th.
Historically, the budget, for example, how close at the end of the year are you generally with what you're budgeting versus what your expenditures are?
Well, on the expenditure side, we think it's a good budget to actual if the variance is 1% or less. And oftentimes, we've been within $10,000. We adjust the
Really?
budget a couple of times a year. And why we're so accurate on the expenditure side is we settle the labor contracts and we control the personnel, so we run the payroll and we know where those dollars are being spent. There are times when the magnitude is greater if we have unplanned emergencies, if a boiler goes down or we need a major repair that was unplanned. We'll use fund balance. Hopefully it's at a time when we can compensate and spend less elsewhere. So we have the opportunity to control quite a bit because the building and grounds supervisor works with me. As I mentioned before, the transportation manager works with me. And those are two areas where there's quite a bit of expenditure to outside vendors. And we're able to adjust mid-year if we know we're in difficulty.
I would imagine probably like a year like this year where you got unusual amount of snow plowing, because is that an outside source?
Yes.
You got, I mean, I got the same thing in my office, holy buckets, I'm way over what I normally planned on for snow plowing and things like this. Is there a source at the state where you can go and request additional funds to help offset unforeseen natural, I don't want to call them natural disasters, but, unforeseen budgeting issues that...
Not for things of that nature, but what we can do, if we have something that is an insurance claim related. For example, if we have a roofing issue that might have been a tornado related incident, well, we're insured for that. Or if we have other catastrophes, we do have insurance for some of those things. But if I have a heavier snow expense or I have a heavier salt expense that folks have experienced off and on in the last few years, shame on me for not having the right budget in the first place, and we do. But if for some reason it exceeded that, then we would do less things in the spring with the maintenance department, or we would report to the school board that we're going to have a budget adjustment, but next year in our budget planning, we're going to spend less in the summer for some of the district-wide repairs we might do. We would make it up in the next budget cycle.
What percentage of the employees are actually, their health insurance is being covered by the unions and the health insurance are covered by the school district?
Well, the benefits expense, whether it's the matching Social Security payments, the FICA on your check.
FICA, on my side is FICA, okay.
Other mandatory withholding amounts like that, and health insurance or dental insurance are all part of our benefit package, much like a private sector employer. So when I say we've got 80% of our budget is people, it really is 60% wage compensation and 20% these mandatory benefits such as FICA or PERA or TRA, the teacher's retirement.
Teacher retirement.
We pay in as well as the employees pay into those pension funds. And they're current, they're paid. In a lot of our contracts, the health insurance has an employee or an employer contribution or a combination, and that's an expense for us. So that's part of that 20% mix. And you're right, we negotiate with the unions to determine every 2 years how much is district paid or how much is employee paid. And so that's inside of that 20% I talk about. The rules have changed. The Affordable Care Act now is requiring coverage for people that have 30 hours or more. That wasn't always the case. And so you see the private sector talking about this quite a bit. The public sector is as well.
Dr. Mattson, with the, in the college side of things, there's ways of appropriating and applying for grants and gifts and things like this. Do the school districts have that same luxury and privilege to be able to go solicit funds from various various departments of the government?
Well, there are many sources for grants, and so we certainly take advantage of those. There are some school districts that employ a grant writer.
I was just going to ask you, is there an employee, a grant writer on staff?
No.
Oh.
You're looking at two.
Grant. Okay.
But, you know, there are other folks as well that do apply for grants, so we certainly pursue those. But it is on top of, you know, someone's additional responsibilities to apply for those. We also, you know, we have to really note that we get a lot of contributions from our families and from our communities. Every school board meeting, we read off the contributions that have been made by various people. So some people might donate dollars or items to the school district, but our PTAs and PTOs do a fabulous job of you know, having carnivals. If you have elementary children,
Oh, yeah.
or remember that
Yeah.
from
now I
those
got
days.
the grandkids.
So the
I got
grandkids,
lots
yep.
of grandkids.
So you're at those carnivals and all those different activities that the PTAs partake in, especially at the elementary level. And then the booster clubs as well at the secondary level through athletics and activities. So there's thousands of dollars that come in from those different organizations that we're very thankful for. You may be familiar with smart boards that are in elementary and secondary buildings, but they really started at the elementary level in our district. And almost all of them were purchased initially through those dollars given to us by the PTA and PTO. So we would be much farther behind with technology in that realm had it not been for those contributions of those groups.
The last 10 years have averaged between 0.5% to 1% increases, and prior to that, we probably were closer to a 2 to 3% per year magnitude. And what this decline in funding, because remember now, the state sources were sales tax and income taxes, economically driven. Most of our money is tied to how well the state of Minnesota does. What that really has driven us to do is ask for operating levies from the voters. And we renewed an operating levy a few years back at the same level. And this is a chart that shows our athletic conference. So we can go to the voters and say, can you provide us some more operating dollars? And our school board has been pretty conservative over the history because we're at the same level that we were. It's simply a renewal of the same monies. This $725 per pupil in Forest Lake generates about $6 million for us.
Oh.
So it's a little bit less than 10% of our $65 million general fund budget. In South Washington County, they're generating $929 per pupil. Centennial Schools, $964. So they're going to be representing much higher percentages than our $725. In Stillwater, for example, that per pupil amount is $1,012. Hastings, is part of our conference, $1,464 per pupil. Mounds View, $1,523 per pupil. Roseville and White Bear Lake, both between $1,575 and $1,580 per pupil, more than double what we have in Forest Lake for an additional resource asked of the taxpayers.
That is interesting. If we have a declining enrollment, for example, let me rephrase it. Is Moundsville School District bigger than Forest Lakes School District?
Yes,
It
their
is.
enrollment is, I think, closer to a 10,000 range.
10,000. And so their $1,523 that they're receiving with all the additional items that they have to provide, the buildings and the additional teachers and additional staffing and everything else, is this all part of where that number is established at?
Well, these are all per student numbers.
They are.
So they're comparable whether or not you're a larger district or not. So in Mounds View, at $1,523 per student versus our $725, they have more than double the additional money. Our additional money represents 10% of our budget. That means they're getting 20% of their budget through this process. They have an additional 10%. It would be like another $6 million at Forest Lake. Boy, think of the teachers we could hire with that.
Well, just some of the improvements that are needed.
And it's only operating funds that this relates to. So it would be persons or possibly contract repairs or contract services.
Those kind of numbers are staggering. You know, it's mind-boggling to see what a differential it truly is. And even the state average is 921, and you look at some of the school districts, you go up to some of the, like Pine County, it's one of the so-called, quote, poorest districts in the state of Minnesota, and if they fit into the average, I mean, you're looking at some real interesting information.
Now, when you look at this, it truly does demonstrate the fiscal conservative nature of our school board.
I'm going to tell you something. These numbers still hold true for the city too. And when you start drawing a correlation across the city of Forest Lake's operating budget is one of the lesser of all the ones around, and good portion of all these that you've named, and you know, and it's always been we took great pride in being able to do that, but at the same token, I always had the attitude that we can be sometimes penny wise and dollar foolish, and we don't. There are certain things we have to spend money on, and you spend money on this item that costs $1 or this one for $1.50, but the $1.50 is going to last 3 times longer than the $1, but everyone wants to spend the $1, and I'd say no, let's spend the $1.50, you know. So I mean, you know, going through this scenario, this is very interesting because I can't believe what a direct correlation it is with the city budget. You know?
The other correlation too, we through our strategic plan, one of the pieces that we've been looking at is wages for all of the employees that are in the school district to see, are they comparable, where do we land, and when we do the comparison, and Larry was part of that along with Donna Friedman last year of pulling together that information, and it's a direct correlation to what you see right here. It's not a surprise, but people often talk about you know, wages for teachers, et cetera, that are lower in Forest Lake compared to other districts. And this is part of the reason, certainly, is that when you look at the amount that other districts have versus us, it's not a surprise that those wages are comparable to the funding that we receive.
Yeah, that is interesting. We had the same issue also, and I didn't realize this before I got on the council, but there's a state agency that regulates for city, county workers and everything, and they come back in and will do a comparison analysis to find out how it is. And there's a mandate that they have, you have to bring them up to a certain level in order, and I will say this, I had a problem with that, okay? I didn't vote for it, but, and not for the reason that the people aren't entitled to it, but because of the fact that we had, it just came at a wrong time. You know, we were struggling with trying to come up with a balanced budget, and this came halfway through the year. So you know, I said, let's bring it out to the end of the year and then we can talk about it. But, you know, that made a difference, and it was difficult. It was very difficult. Now, Larry, going back to the tax statement, so often if you have various types of funding that shows up on that tax statement, and then over a period of time that funding has been satisfied, there's never any indication that I'm aware of, correct me if I'm wrong, that shows that this fund, we'll call it Fund A, has been satisfied and it's paid off as. How do people know that the funds have been satisfied and maybe there's another fund that has taken its place?
That's an excellent question. In terms of something being satisfied, the best example, since most of what we've been talking about today is operational expenses,
Correct.
best example would be when we issue bonds, and Century School was built, for example, back in 1998 through
Was it really?
2000.
Okay.
So those bonds were sold. They had a 20-year time frame, and they will be paid off by 2020 here. I think actually in 2019 is the end date. On the property tax statement, we only have two lines. We've got the state determined amount and the voter approved amount. If we didn't have any more bonds issued, that voter approved line in 2020 would be less. But if people wanted to see detail, they could absolutely contact our office or come to our tax hearings that we hold during December, because that type of detail is then presented at those meetings.
Yeah, that's always been a personal question of mine as well. You know, you keep paying and you don't think anything about it, and then after, like we've been here now over, 41 years, so I've looked at it that we've gone through 2 complete or 3 complete bonding cycles of various schools and never did ever know if they were, you know, paid off.
And that voter approved line goes up and down depending on whether things are paid off or if you're in the middle of a 20 or 30-year time frame, because bonds for buildings is really just like the mortgage on a house. It's the principal and interest you pay, and ultimately in year 20 or in year 30, it's satisfied.
Now, are these bonds sold through a broker and they, you know, they put them out for sale? Explain a little bit about that.
Well, that's a public process, and you usually have a financial advisor like Ehlers and Associates, Northland, Springstead. There's several folks in the market. Bonds are sold out to institutional investors. So Piper Jaffray might pick up some of the bonds, or another finance firm in New York might pick up the bonds. And ultimately, they may end up in your portfolio in your personal 401k because an institutional investor for the private sector might have purchased them.
Sure.
So they're out on the open market, and we get really good rates, just like the county or the city would. They beat the car loan rates available today.
I hope so. I hope so. That is good. Now, with that process, it's not a zero coupon styled financing. It's a bonding type.
But there's
financing.
all sorts of tools available, and that's why the county, the city, or the school district in our case would hire such a consultant. They're going to determine whether or not you're going to use a bank qualified issue or whether or not you're going to go with bonds that have a term, or if we're going to register them, if they're book entry only, all sorts of decisions. We're here to run the schools. We've got financial experts that can do all of those Wall Street style details.
Well, that, yeah, all the governmental agencies function real similar, maybe not in the same vein, but they're similar in nature, and and they handle all of it, and and they're entitled to their fee for doing it, and they handle it for you. And now, if a bond is issued, you get all the money for the bond at one time.
Yes. Now, in terms of some of the borrowing that we've typically done, we'll do the cash flow borrowing. When the state has slowed down our payments and we need to get a working capital loan, we'll issue certificates of anticipation, and that means we're anticipating state aid or we're anticipating property taxes. When those are sold, they only have a 13-month time frame, and we get all the money up front. If we're looking at bonding issues, we might phase that with several issues or just one issue, but you get the money up front and then you pay for it over that 20 or 30-year time frame. And in the event that you have some sort of project that the magnitude is so great that you need to look at spending that proceed amount over 2 years, if it exceeds 2 years, you're going to want to issue in a couple of different time frames, because we cannot be about the business of making a lot of interest income while we're spending down the funds. Arbitrage rules that the U.S. Treasury has, if we don't phase these bond sales, the IRS wants some money from us while we're spending that down. So arbitrage is a concern for any government. So in that case, you don't want all the money at once. You want some of it now because you'll spend that within the 2-year time frame. But if you have a construction project that's going to go 4 years, you're probably going to have 2 issuances to avoid arbitrage.
It's hard to imagine the IRS would want to come in and take money it comes out of the same pool. I mean, the money that you've got and the money they got. I mean, I don't understand some of this stuff. It's amazing.
So we could absolutely want the money in 2 phases as opposed to all at once.
Now, if for the average person, everybody's tax statement comes out and they move forward and they look at it. Like I said, they get it in the mail. They go, oh, hey, well, taxes went down 5%. Now, when you are operating, and if you have a downfall in attendance, at what point in time do you know you're going to have a downturn in attendance in order to operate the budget appropriately? Because historically, if you go by Forest Lake, everybody puts their house up for sale in March, and then they'll move in the summer to some other place with their kids so they can enroll their kids into fall school. How can you manage that, that part of the equation? Because it's got to be very difficult.
Well, you have to make a best guess, of course, about that, and sometimes you're on and sometimes you perhaps aren't. And I think with open enrollment, with people having more choice of where they attend school, so private schools, charter schools, other school districts, there's even more uncertainty about what the number is going to be. So you do your best planning. You look at, we're anxious to see enrollment for next year at the secondary level, kindergarten enrollment, what those numbers are. I mean, we're anxious to see, the families that sign up to come in, because that certainly makes a difference in how many kindergarten teachers we need. But then we do that planning, but then it's the kids that walk in the door on that first day. So we're always looking at that, again, anxious to see those numbers, and over the first couple of weeks of school, how that stabilizes and where we land. So of course, we try to be conservative with that. And at the same time, sometimes we're pleasantly surprised and have more students that come in. And then sometimes, it ends up that there are fewer than we expected.
Now, Greg, it's pretty straightforward, though, to your point about how do we adjust expenditures. If most of our money is coming to us on a per-student basis, based
Correct.
on the legislature's determined formulas, and then we estimate how many students will be here in the fall and throughout the year, we staff accordingly. So the staffing process is how we balance that budget. If we're having a reduction in revenue due to fewer students, then of course we're going to have fewer staff members. We want to maintain good class sizes, but that is what is the expenditure side's relief valve.
Now, if the charter schools, we got the one just up the road here, and then we got, do we not have one in Wyoming, I think?
We have Lakes International Language Academy and North Lakes Academy.
In North Lakes. Now, has that affected the public school district? Because I'm assuming they function on a different type of financing from the state. Maybe I'm wrong. Or let me rephrase it. How do they function their financing, and is it similar to Forest Lake School District for them on a smaller scale?
It's very similar. They don't have the property tax component. So the state is not only doing similar funding formulas like our 80, 81, 82%, but since we have 15% of our money coming in property taxes, they are much closer to 90, 95% funded by the state. Interesting thing to note, we provide transportation services for both of those charter schools,
That was my next question.
and we provide food service operations for one of them.
Now, that I did not know. That is interesting.
And the same thing with St. Peter, which is a
Well-
private school.
Right. Now, I'm assuming that you send a bill to them and they pay it, or how does that work?
With transportation, it works out kind of nice because the state will fund transportation for them if they're providing it, or the state will do its own accounting shifts internally and send us the money for the students of theirs that we're transporting.
So, wow, that's interesting. So,
It happens all across the state.
does it? Does the state of Minnesota function in their compensation similar to every state in the union?
That I don't know. That's a great question.
I don't know either. I'm sitting here and I'm listening and I'm going, I know for a fact down in Texas it is different than what we have here.
I wouldn't be surprised if
It is
most are
Yeah,
different.
very different. But getting back to actually the operations of the facilities, we have a situation in Forest Lake. When was the high school built?
1971, I believe.
71. Okay, so we got, we got a very old building that if we put a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the best, what is the actual, the condition of the building, even with all the money that we put in for maintenance and service and everything else? Is it a 5? Is it a 6 building? I mean, because at some point in time, everything has a life cycle. And in our life cycle, I mean, even, I deal with, in my secular job, I deal with life cycle costing on a lot of buildings for people to help them determine whether they should remodel, tear down, or continue on. And, with what it is, and using duct tape and bubble gum. The one thing I've always found is everybody always has a very difficult time accepting the fact that a building has done its duty. It has served well, and it's time to make a change because they look at it and go, it doesn't seem like there's anything wrong with it. But when a building gets to be that old, you can only keep doing so much maintenance and things.
Well, I tell you this, we've talked about some of the resources that our athletic conference folks have that we don't. And yet, with the resources we do have, our custodial staff, our leadership, they're proud of what they've done with what they have.
Oh, I think
But
they
we
should be.
have a lot of needs. It really can be pointed out. And when you talk life cycle, we've got elementary schools, some of which were built in the 50s. We've got a lot of needs across the district that without the resources, and the first chart we showed, the funding's been flat. The next chart shows because flat funding across the state, some districts have gone to the voters. We've resisted for quite some time. I think it shows in the buildings. I wouldn't want to rate them because we do the best we can with
Oh,
what
of course
we
you do.
have.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's no question about that. I think that the district as a whole, the buildings are in excellent shape for the vintage they are. And, and I get called into all kinds. That's my job, So I get a chance to see them all.
I mean, we're not meeting current design standards or indoor air quality issues, but are they clean? Yes. Try to keep the floors shiny? Yes.
Yes.
So I think we do a good job with what we have.
Now, are you allowed in the financing structure, for example, to go a different direction and, for example, for a bond and be able to raise funds, for example, to come forward to the handicap requirements that we have in public buildings, things like this? Is there funding that is available for the school district to be doing these kind of things in addition to, or a different way to garner that money?
We really have two options that can provide funding that's of a meaningful magnitude. Asking for levy for learning funds, that's the operating levy. We talk about we're at 725 and the other, so that's to provide funding for teachers or books or possibly ongoing maintenance. That is that type of a fund request. We can also put a bond in front of the voters to make improvements to the building or things of that nature. So bonds are for buildings, the operating levy is for the learning component, and we don't have the ability to make special requests. We continue to lobby legislators with this type of data, try to make things more fair for Forest Lake, try to make things, because when you mention just in the property tax realm, and that's not our whole funding picture, but that's one aspect.
Right.
When you look at the region, the Star Tribune's property tax report shows that in all of our municipalities, we are in the lowest quartile. And that's compared to folks like Centennial or the folks in Mounds View here that we've discussed, or White Bear Lake even. We are far below in each municipality that we serve, because the school district is the common denominator in addition to conservative nature of some of our municipalities as well.
I think the quality of what we're getting out of the district has been demonstrated in some of our other shows where we did the Hall of Fame. I wanted to sit here so that this whole camera presented success, and it all starts here. And I think this poster probably has more value sitting here through the whole process of this show than probably we realize, because there's so many components that come together for the actual functionality of a school district. And I know when I was involved with the city, people had no idea the magnitude of what had to be done and how a city functions. And so consequently, I just could extrapolate that out and say they have no way of knowing. All they know is their kids go to school, then they go from second grade to third grade, or fifth grade to sixth grade, or whatever, and then they graduate, and I really want this series to bring people of Forest Lake a solid educational foundation that they can understand what the money is going for, how, and if there's not enough, what needs to be done, and to help bring this about so that everybody can sit back and go, yeah, these are things that I want for my children. I can remember I really was disappointed when the charter schools went in, and I voted against the one charter school that wanted to go out by the ice complex and athletic complex, and I was very much against the fact of the value of the property was too high to put it into a non-tax status for the city. And so they went up to Wyoming, and Wyoming gave them what they wanted. But I was looking at it from a different perspective, and it's still the same point. The district in comparison based on the numbers is really, it's doing a marvelous job for what we have available to us. But on the other side of the coin, it's almost starving in comparison and trying to, we've got to, as citizens, we have to step up and feed the resources that we have here, and how do, and how do we go about doing it. The funding side of it is something that, people generally don't want to get involved with. They got their own personal checkbook, and that's all they worry about. And as long as they have a buck left at the end of the month, they're happy and life goes on. But that is not the way that we've got to look at this. And this was why I wanted this portion of the meeting to be really looked at very significantly, because these graphs will be brought forth. These graphs will be included into the show. Now, unfortunately, I still got about 15 questions that I wanted to do, and we're running out of time. But what I'd like to do is, Larry, have you got anything that you'd like to bring forth to the public? Because here's your opportunity.
Well, I sure do, because when you had mentioned earlier, we sure get a big bang for our buck. I want to tell you why. It's those 1,100 people that we mentioned. They come here every day. They're proud of what they do, and our students really achieve results. And
We do.
This is a great organization, and it is because of the pride of those 1,100 people.
And that is evident. That is evident. Dr. Mattson.
Well, I would just echo the same thing, that as you go around, I go around to different employee groups every month and talk to them and update them on what's happening in the district. So I am able to interact with them quite often, and I am proud to work here. I'm proud to have graduated from here. And people do work very hard. They're very, as Larry said, proud of what they do, and the accomplishments that our kids have are really quite remarkable. And I think we are really looking at some of the facts behind, because I think people do question and sometimes want additional pieces in the school system, and they should ask for that and they should expect it. And we can do some things, but there are some restraints that are put on us. And as we've talked about today, the state funding is one, that it hasn't kept up with inflation, and that there is that gap. And then we do have some opportunities as local taxpayers to add into that, and we have made that decision in Forest Lake, and we're certainly thankful for that. But other districts have made the decision to add more, and in some cases double what we do in Forest Lake. As Larry mentioned, if we had $6 million more, just imagine what we might do with that $6 million if we had that. And so I think we are realistic about what we can do. We work very hard, and at the same time looking at, well, this is where we're at, and are we satisfied here? Do we want something more? What are the mechanisms that are in place? What can we do to change some of those things? So it's lobbying our legislators to talk about that state funding, or it's also looking locally to see if we have that opportunity, do we want to take it and possibly increase that as well.
Well, I can't thank you enough for the two of you for your time.
Thank you.
Larry, thanks for articulating some of these things that I think a lot of people need to know. It's not, they need to know these things because information becomes knowledge, and knowledge can be used for good decisions. And this is something that the people of Forest Lake that participate in paying their taxes, which is everybody, should know where, why, when, and some of these things that go on. And I thank you a lot for taking the time. Dr. Masson,
Yeah.
it's always a pleasure.
Thanks.
And we will be seeing each other again in a very near future for another phase of Your Schools in Action. And once again, if anybody has any questions, by all means, attend a school board meeting or go to the tax levy informational meeting in December. That'll be coming up. And by all means, support your schools. Thank you. And we will be talking to you in the very near future with another interesting subject for Your Schools in Forest Lake in Action.